The morning sun of June 4th, 1942, painted the Pacific waters crimson as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail with quiet confidence. Behind him stretched the most formidable naval armada Japan had ever assembled. 4 magnificent aircraft carriers flanked by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that had struck fear into the hearts of enemies from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. Vice Admiral Nagumo adjusted his cap against the salt spray, his dark eyes scanning the horizon where Midway Atoll lay like a speck of sand in the vast blue expanse. For 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been unstoppable, sweeping across the Pacific with the fury of a divine wind. Today would be no different, or so he believed. "Admiral," came the voice of his aide, Lieutenant Commander Suzuki. "The first wave is prepared for launch against Midway." Nagumo nodded curtly. 108 aircraft sat poised on the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Dive bombers, level bombers, and Zero fighters that would reduce the American base to rubble. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Neutralize Midway's defenses, then await the inevitable counterattack from the American fleet. When Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces arrived, they would face the full might of the combined fleet and be destroyed utterly. The thunder of aircraft engines filled the morning air as the first wave launched into the azure sky. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, hero of Pearl Harbor, led the formation toward Midway, his voice crackling over the radio as he coordinated the attack. Below, the carrier crews worked with mechanical precision, preparing the second wave of aircraft that would deliver the killing blow to any American ships foolish enough to venture within range. What Nagumo did not know, what none of them knew, was that 800 miles to the northeast, American codebreakers had already read their mail. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25, and Admiral Nimitz knew exactly where the enemy fleet would be. 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were racing toward an intercept point, their pilots grimly aware that they faced overwhelming odds. As referenced in historian Gordon Pranga's seminal work, Miracle at Midway, the Japanese confidence was not misplaced. On paper, they possessed every advantage. Aboard the Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey checked his watch and studied the reconnaissance reports. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the Earth, lay the most powerful naval force ever assembled. His squadron of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers would soon face the legendary Zero fighters that had swept Allied aircraft from Pacific skies with contemptuous ease. The irony was palpable. Both fleets were steaming toward each other in the pre-dawn darkness, each convinced of victory, neither aware that this day would mark the turning point of the Pacific War. The Japanese had tasted nothing but triumph since December 7th, 1941. Their pilots were veterans, their ships the finest in the world, their tactics proven in a dozen victories. But pride, as the ancient Greeks knew well, often precedes destruction. As the sun climbed higher and the morning mist burned away from the Pacific swells, the stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles, a clash that would determine whether the rising sun would continue its inexorable march across the Pacific, or whether the tide of war would turn in favor of the Stars and Stripes. The die was cast, the players in position. In a matter of hours, Japan's mighty fleet would indeed break in silence, but not in the way Admiral Nagumo anticipated. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong came at 0700 hours when Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's voice crackled through the radio static aboard the Akagi. His attack on Midway had encountered fierce resistance, stronger than intelligence had predicted. American fighters had risen to meet the Japanese bombers with unexpected ferocity, and the island's anti-aircraft defenses remained largely intact. "Admiral Nagumo," Tomonaga's voice carried the strain of combat, "recommend second attack on Midway. Island facilities still operational. Request immediate reinforcement." Nagumo felt the first flutter of unease in his chest. Intelligence reports had suggested Midway would fall quickly, like a house of cards before the Japanese onslaught. Yet here was Tomonaga, one of his finest squadron leaders, reporting that the Americans were fighting with the desperation of cornered tigers. The admiral faced a crucial decision. His second wave of aircraft sat on the carrier decks, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking enemy ships. Standard doctrine dictated keeping them ready for naval combat, the primary mission. But if Midway's airfield remained operational, American land-based bombers would continue to pose a threat to his fleet. Order the second wave rearmed with high-explosive bombs for ground attack, Nagumo commanded after a moment's deliberation. We must silence those airfields. It was at precisely this moment, 0728 hours on June 4th, 1942, that the first American scout plane spotted the Japanese fleet. Ensign Jack Reed, flying a consolidated PBY Catalina patrol bomber, peered through his binoculars at a sight that made his blood freeze. Spread across the ocean like a vast steel constellation were more enemy warships than he had ever imagined. Many. Planes heading Midway bearing 320, distance 150 miles, Reed radioed back to Midway, his voice tight with controlled excitement. Then, minutes later, came the message that would electrify every American commander in the Pacific. Main body enemy fleet sighted. 2 carriers and main body ships bearing 280, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance received the contact report with the calm demeanor that had made him one of the Navy's most respected tacticians. Unlike the flamboyant Bull Halsey, who normally commanded this task force but lay ill in Pearl Harbor, Spruance was methodical, calculating. He studied the plotting board with the intensity of a chess master, contemplating a crucial move. The trap was springing shut exactly as Admiral Nimitz had predicted. The Japanese, focused on their attack against Midway, had not yet discovered the American carriers lurking to their northeast. For perhaps the first time since Pearl Harbor, American naval forces had achieved tactical surprise against the Imperial Japanese Navy. Launch the attack, Spruance ordered quietly. All available aircraft, the flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet erupted into controlled chaos as Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, Douglas Devastator torpedo planes, and Grumman Wildcat fighters were spotted for launch. The pilots who manned these aircraft knew they faced veteran Japanese aircrew flying superior equipment, but they also knew this might be their only chance to strike the enemy carriers while their decks were crowded with aircraft and aviation. Gasoline. Meanwhile, aboard the patched and battle-scarred Yorktown, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was launching his own strike force. The carrier had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea that Navy engineers estimated 3 months would be needed for proper repairs. Instead, Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers had labored around the clock for 72 hours, sending Yorktown back to sea with welders still aboard, completing emergency repairs even as she steamed toward battle. As the American strike aircraft formed up and headed southwest toward the Japanese fleet, the stage was set for one of naval aviation's most dramatic encounters. The hunters had become the hunted, though Admiral Nagumo remained blissfully unaware that his mighty fleet was about to face its greatest test. Time was running short, and destiny waited somewhere beyond the horizon. At 0920 hours, the sea around the Japanese fleet erupted in geysers of white water as the first American torpedo planes found their targets. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet had located Nagumo's carriers, despite navigation errors that had scattered the rest of the American strike force across empty ocean. Waldron, a part Sioux warrior from South Dakota, led his 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers in a desperate low-level attack against the carrier Soryu. The obsolescent Devastators, flying at barely 50 feet above the waves, were sitting ducks for the Japanese combat air. Patrol Zero fighters descended on them like hawks upon sparrows, their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns raking the American aircraft with deadly precision. One by one, Waldron's planes disappeared in flowers of flame and smoke. The lieutenant commander himself went down fighting, his Devastator cartwheeling into the sea in a cascade of burning aviation fuel. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers were destroyed, their crews joining the spirits of their ancestors beneath the Pacific swells. Only Ensign George Gay survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the oil-slicked water, hidden from Japanese eyes by the wreckage of his aircraft. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was repeated again and again as more American torpedo planes arrived piecemeal over the next hour. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise suffered equally devastating losses, as did Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. The Japanese defenders, their confidence swelling with each easy victory, began to believe the American attack was nothing more than a poorly coordinated suicide mission. Admiral Nagumo, watching the slaughter from Akagi's bridge, allowed himself a grim smile. The American pilots were brave, he would grant them that, but bravery without skill was merely a path to an honorable death. His Zero fighters had shot down nearly 40 enemy torpedo planes without losing a single carrier to their attacks. What Nagumo did not realize was that the torpedo squadrons had unwittingly executed the perfect tactical diversion. By attacking at sea level, they had drawn every Japanese fighter down to wave-top altitude. The combat air patrol that should have been positioned at 20,000 feet to intercept high-altitude bombers was instead circling just above the water, their pilots intoxicated by the ease of their victories. At 10:24 hours, as the last burning American torpedo plane splashed into the sea, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise finally found the Japanese fleet after a lengthy search over empty ocean. McCluskey, nearly out of fuel and about to turn back, had followed the wake of a Japanese destroyer that was racing to rejoin the main force after investigating a submarine contact. From 18,000 feet, McCluskey gazed down at a sight that made his heart race. Spread below him like models in a bathtub were 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden decks, and ordnance was stacked in neat piles waiting to be loaded onto the second-wave bombers. As noted in Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, the timing could not have been more perfect from the American perspective, or more catastrophic from the Japanese viewpoint. "This is McCluskey," the squadron commander radioed to his pilots, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Attack! Attack!" the Douglas Dauntless dive. Bombers peeled off into their deadly dives, screaming down through the morning sky like angels of vengeance. Each pilot selected his target with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that this moment would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Below, Japanese lookouts finally spotted the diving bombers and began shouting warnings, but it was too late. The trap had been sprung, and there was no escape. The universe seemed to hold its breath as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dauntless dive bombers plummeted toward their targets at terminal velocity. From 18,000 feet, the Japanese carriers below looked like intricate ship models, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance in a deadly tableau of vulnerability. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leader of bombing. Squadron 6 had selected the carrier Akagi as his primary target. As his Dauntless screamed downward through the thin air, Best could see Japanese sailors scurrying across the carrier's deck like ants from a disturbed nest. Anti-aircraft fire began to bracket his aircraft, black puffs of smoke and orange flashes that seemed to reach up from the sea itself. At precisely 10:26 hours, Best released his 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb and pulled out of his dive with crushing G-forces that grayed his vision. Behind him, Lieutenant Edwin Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber followed their squadron leader down. Their bombs also aimed at the flagship of Admiral Nagumo's carrier force. The first bomb struck Akagi just aft of her island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar. The blast ignited aviation gasoline that had been spilled during the hasty rearming operations, creating a sheet of flame that raced across the hangar deck. Within seconds, the explosion reached the ordnance storage areas, and secondary explosions began to tear the carrier apart from within. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown was attacking the carrier Soryu. Leslie's own bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned during the approach, but his wingmen pressed home their attacks with deadly precision. 3 bombs struck Soryu in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into an inferno of burning aircraft and exploding ammunition. The third carrier, Kaga, fell victim to Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey himself and the remaining pilots of his Enterprise squadrons. 4 bombs hit the massive carrier almost simultaneously, each one contributing to a growing conflagration that would soon consume the ship entirely. Kaga's flight deck erupted like a volcano as the fires reached her. Aviation fuel storage tanks. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen on Akagi's bridge as his flagship shuddered under the impact of American bombs. The proud carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor was dying beneath his feet, her steel hull groaning as internal explosions tore through her compartments. Smoke poured from every opening, and the acrid smell of burning fuel and rubber filled the air. "Admiral!" shouted his aide, Lieutenant Commander Suzuki, his voice barely audible above the roar of flames and the screaming of wounded men. "We must transfer to another ship." But Nagumo seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. In the space of 4 minutes, 3/4 of his carrier force had been reduced to burning hulks. The same flight decks that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor were now cauldrons of fire and twisted metal. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that it seemed impossible. Minutes earlier, Nagumo had commanded the most powerful carrier force in the world. His Zeros had been slaughtering American torpedo planes with contemptuous ease, and victory had seemed assured. Now, the primary strength of the combined fleet was being consumed by flames that no amount of damage control could extinguish, as detailed in historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II. The reversal of fortune at Midway was so dramatic that it seemed to defy the laws of probability. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu chose to go down with his ship, lashing himself to the bridge as the carrier settled into her death throes. His executive officer pleaded with him to abandon ship, but Yanagimoto remained steadfast in the tradition of Bushido. "I am the captain," he replied simply. "I must share the fate of my ship." The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately from the main force and escaped the initial American attack. But her reprieve would be temporary. The Americans had tasted blood, and they would not be satisfied until every enemy flat top lay beneath the Pacific waves. In 4 minutes of precise bombing, the course of World War II in the Pacific had been irrevocably altered. Japan's mighty fleet was indeed breaking, but not in the silence of anticipated victory, rather in the thunder of exploding ordnance and the screams of burning men. From the flight deck of the carrier Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese flat top, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi watched pillars of black smoke rise from his sister ships with the stoic calm of a samurai facing inevitable death. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were finished, their flight decks buckled and burning, their hangars consumed by fires that fed on aviation gasoline and high-octane dreams of empire. "Admiral," reported Captain Tomeo Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, "we have 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters ready for launch. Request permission to strike the American carriers." Yamaguchi nodded grimly. He had been Admiral Yamamoto's protege, groomed for high command, but today he would likely die in these waters. Honor demanded that Hiryu sell herself dearly, taking as many American ships with her as possible. If Japan was to lose this battle, at least one enemy carrier would burn alongside the pride of the combined fleet. At 1100 hours, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led Hiryu's strike force into the morning sky, their destination the American task force that had dealt such devastating blows to the mobile force. The pilots were veterans, survivors of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean raids. They flew with the desperate courage of men who knew their homeland's fate hung in the balance. Meanwhile, aboard the American carriers, damage control parties worked frantically to prepare for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. Admiral Spruance, his tactical genius now evident to all, had launched search planes to locate the fourth enemy carrier that reconnaissance had reported. The battle was far from over. As long as one Japanese flat top remained operational, the American fleet remained in mortal danger. The Japanese strike force found Yorktown first, the carrier that had been hastily repaired after Coral Sea now steaming, in formation with her consorts. Lieutenant Kobayashi's dive bombers screamed down through heavy anti-aircraft fire, their pilots displaying the same skill and determination that had made the Imperial Japanese Navy feared throughout the Pacific. 3. Bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first hit amidships, penetrating the flight deck and starting fires in the hangar. The second bomb exploded near the island superstructure, killing and wounding dozens of men. The third bomb damaged the carrier's uptakes, reducing her speed and filling her passages with choking smoke. Captain Elliot Buckmaster fought valiantly to save his ship, his damage control parties displaying the same heroism that Japanese sailors had shown aboard their burning carriers. Within an hour, Yorktown's fires were under control, and she was making 20 knots, her flight deck operational despite the damage, but Yamaguchi was not finished. At 1300 hours, he launched a second strike. 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot, who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga's fuel tank had been punctured by anti-aircraft fire during the earlier mission, but he volunteered to lead this final assault, despite knowing he lacked sufficient fuel to return to Hiryu. The Japanese torpedo planes approached Yorktown. From multiple angles, their pilots displaying the tactical brilliance that had made them masters of the Pacific. Despite heavy defensive fire from the carrier's escorting cruisers and destroyers, 2 torpedoes found their mark, ripping massive holes in Yorktown's port side below the waterline. The carrier began to list heavily to port as seawater poured into her engineering spaces. Captain Buckmaster, recognizing that his ship was beyond saving, gave the order to abandon ship. Hundreds of sailors and airmen slid down ropes into the oil-covered water, where destroyers waited to pluck them from the sea. As noted in Robert Ballard's underwater exploration, Return to Midway, Yorktown's final moments exemplified the courage and sacrifice that characterized both sides during this epic battle. But Yamaguchi's victory was Pyrrhic. Even as Yorktown died, American scout planes had located Hiryu. At 1500 hours, 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, found the last Japanese carrier and subjected her to the same treatment her sisters had received that morning. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck, turning her into another floating pyre. Admiral Yamaguchi, following the samurai code, chose to remain aboard his flagship as she burned. "I am responsible for the destruction of the mobile force," he signaled to Admiral Yamamoto. "I alone should pay the price. The eagle had made her last strike, but she too was falling from the sky, her wings clipped by American bombs, and her proud spirit about to join her sisters beneath the Pacific waves." As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the ocean resembled a vast graveyard lit by the funeral pyres of burning warships. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the cream of the Imperial Navy's fast carrier force, drifted helplessly in the swells, their steel hulls glowing like forge furnaces as internal fires consumed everything combustible within their compartments. Aboard the dying flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo finally allowed himself to be evacuated to the light cruiser Nagara as flames engulfed the bridge where he had stood so confidently that morning. The admiral's face was a mask of stoic despair. In 12 hours, he had witnessed the destruction of Japan's most potent naval weapon, the carrier force that had terrorized the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the ED, Akagi remained with his ship until the very end, supervising damage control efforts that everyone knew were futile. The carrier's flight deck had buckled from the heat of burning aviation fuel, and her hull plates were beginning to warp as the fires reached temperatures that could melt steel. At 0200 hours on June 5th, Aoki finally gave the order to abandon ship, but he made it clear he would not be among the survivors. The Emperor's portrait must be saved, Aoki commanded his executive officer. The sacred image of Emperor. Hirohito, carried aboard every Imperial warship, was carefully removed from the burning carrier and transferred to a destroyer. Only then did the captain allow his crew to abandon their doomed vessel. Similar scenes played out aboard the other stricken carriers. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga supervised the evacuation of his men, even as explosions continued to rock the ships. Ammunition magazines. The massive carrier, originally built as a battleship before conversion, was dying hard. Her thick armor plating contained the fires but also trapped the heat, creating an inferno that would burn for hours. On Soryu, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto had already made his final decision. The diminutive officer, beloved by his crew for his fairness and tactical skill, stood on his bridge as flames licked at the bulkheads around him. When his executive officer pleaded with him to abandon ship, Yanagimoto shook his head with quiet dignity. "I have decided to remain on board," he said simply. "I shall not leave. You may go." Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi faced a similar choice aboard the burning Hiryu. The youngest flag officer in the Japanese Navy, Yamaguchi had been marked for high command by Admiral Yamamoto himself, but honor demanded that he accept responsibility for the catastrophic defeat that had befallen the mobile force under his tactical command. "I am fully and solely responsible for the defeat of the Japanese fleet," Yamaguchi signaled to the combined fleet commander. "I shall remain on board Hiryu and share her fate." His final message was addressed to his wife. "I am grateful for the many things you have done for me. Please take good care of yourself and the children." Throughout the night, Japanese destroyers circled the burning carriers like mourners at a wake, picking up survivors from the oil-covered water while staying clear of the occasional explosions that sent debris hundreds of feet into the air. The sea itself seemed to burn as aviation fuel spread across the surface, creating an apocalyptic scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. As documented in Mitsuo Fuchida's post-war memoir, Midway, The Battle That Doomed, Japan, the psychological impact on Japanese sailors was as devastating as the physical destruction of their ships. Far to the east, Admiral Chester Nimitz received regular updates on the battle from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor. The taciturn commander allowed himself a rare smile as the reports confirmed that the gamble based on breaking the Japanese naval code had paid off spectacularly. 4 enemy carriers destroyed against the loss of 1 American flat top. It was a victory beyond his most optimistic projections. But Nimitz was too experienced an officer to declare victory prematurely. Admiral Yamamoto still commanded the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific, including the massive battleship Yamato with her 18.1-inch guns. If the Japanese commander chose to press forward with his invasion of Midway, the Seis, battle might yet be decided by the big guns rather than aircraft. As the night vigil continued over the Pacific graveyard, both sides prepared for what might be the final act of this epic drama. The carriers were gone, but the war was far from over. Dawn on June 5, 1942, revealed a Pacific transformed. Where the previous morning had seen the mightiest carrier fleet in naval history steaming proudly toward what seemed like certain victory, now only scattered debris and oil slicks marked the graves of Japan's maritime dreams. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, his weathered face etched with lines of grief that seemed to age him a decade overnight. Through his binoculars, he could see the distant smoke plumes that marked the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 4 carriers that had taken years to build and train had been destroyed in a single day by American bombs and the hubris of an empire that had overreached itself. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year before American industrial might overwhelm them, now faced the bitter reality that his prediction was coming true ahead of schedule. The mobile force that was supposed to deliver the knockout blow to American naval power in the Pacific had instead suffered a defeat so complete that it would take years to rebuild, years Japan did not have. "Admiral," reported his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, "we have received damage reports from all 4 carriers. None can be saved." Ugaki's voice carried the weight of a man, delivering his own death sentence. The destruction of the carrier force meant that Japan's ability to project naval air power across the vast Pacific had been crippled, perhaps permanently. Yamamoto nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the magnitude of the catastrophe. The silence that followed was deafening, not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of a dream dying. For 6 months, Japanese naval forces had seemed invincible, sweeping across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. Now that tide had been broken against the coral reefs of a tiny atoll that most Japanese officers had never heard of before this operation. The final chapter of the Midway tragedy played out in the pre-dawn hours when Japanese destroyers, acting on direct orders from the combined fleet, fired torpedoes into the hulks of their own carriers. Akagi, the flagship that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, settled beneath the waves at 0500 hours with Captain Aoki still aboard. Kaga followed an hour later, her massive hull disappearing beneath the Pacific swells that would become her eternal resting place. Soryu and Hiryu, the newer carriers that had embodied Japanese naval aviation technology, sank within minutes of each other as the sun rose over their graves. Captain Yanagimato and Admiral Yamaguchi kept their vigil to the end, choosing honor over survival in the ancient tradition of the samurai. Aboard the American carriers, exhausted pilots and air crew celebrated their victory with the quiet satisfaction of men who had looked death in the face and emerged triumphant. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation skills had found the Japanese fleet at the crucial moment, was recommended for the Navy Cross. The torpedo squadron pilots who had died drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level would receive posthumous recognition for their unwitting sacrifice that made the dive bomber attacks possible. Admiral Nimitz, receiving final confirmation of the Japanese withdrawal from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, issued a simple statement that would become legendary in naval history: "Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged." The understated words concealed the magnitude of what had been accomplished. In 4 days of fighting, the United States Navy had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific from Japan to America. As referenced in naval historian Samuel Eliot, Morrison's official history, Midway marked the turning point where Japan shifted from offensive to defensive operations for the remainder of the war. The silence that settled over the Pacific as the last Japanese ships disappeared over the horizon was indeed the sound of a mighty fleet breaking, not in victory, but in defeat so complete that it would echo through history. Japan's dream of Pacific dominion had died in the waters off Midway Atoll, drowned beneath the waves along with 4 aircraft carriers and the pilots who had flown them. The rising sun still flew over vast territories from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, but its light was already beginning to fade. In the silence that followed Midway's first great strike, the course of World War II had been irrevocably altered, and the long road to Tokyo Bay had begun.